Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, where we foster confessional integrity, liturgical preservation, and preaching that doesn't stink. We believe that the historic liturgy of the divine service is more than mere cobwebs of antiquity, but it is a true treasure of the Church, to be dusted off and brought down from her attic to be enjoyed. So let's get dusting.
Welcome back to the Gottesdienst crowd. This is Jason Braaten. Today we have with us a special guest, first time on the Gottesdienst crowd, Sean Willman. He is the pastor of St. Paul Lutheran Church in Hillsdale, Michigan. Welcome to the Gottesdienst crowd, Sean.
Thank you so much for having me on, Jason. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming. It's great to see you at Bugenhagen and be able to, the Gen X beat you guys. So that was good.
Yeah, there's a first time for everything. And, when you deal with older folks, sometimes you have to be, kind and gentle and respect that they need encouragement. And sometimes it's even in the physical things in life. So it was our pleasure as millennials to give you guys an opportunity. And you know how that goes. If you really beat up on somebody too long, they don't want to play anymore. And we didn't want that.
Yeah. Okay. Very good. We're looking for perhaps a rematch. Let's put it that way.
That makes two of us.
Yeah. Okay. So at Bugenhagen, you gave a sectional on what the biblical view of human sexuality or marriage and then sexual intimacy is. And we know that the world has gone absolutely bonkers on this. I mean, the devil, the world, our own sinful flesh is constantly lying to us about what sexual intimacy is, what the marital act is all about. And so because of that, not only is the world, but even the church has been infected and adulterated in its understanding of what marriage and the marital act is all about. And so what I'd like to talk with you about today is, what is the biblical vision for the blessings of marriage as well as of human sexuality? What is God's order and design for this life? What's the positive understanding of this? And then we can maybe take a look at, how does the world attack this? How does our own flesh attack this and try to take us away? So can you help us build kind of that biblical vision of, why did God institute marriage? What is this all about?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's such a great setup for the conversation, but the topic also in a broad sense. And I'd like to set it up a little bit, if I could, also in the context of when we usually have these conversations.
Yeah.
And most of the time, pastors are talking to parishioners about the purposes of marriage when they show up in your study and tell you, we want to get married, or we're engaged and we're getting married.
And so that's too late.
In a sense, it is. It certainly is. Now, every pastor is going to do his level best in that time that he gets, which, as you know, is never enough. Trying to get a couple to show up and meet together for an hour and a half, 2 hours, a number of weeks in a row or months in a row is a real challenge. And so you do your best in the time that you have. And there's also something here too. It's an awkward thing, I guess, in a certain sense, to talk to your parishioners about about sex. It's just this hard thing. We're going to talk about it from the pulpit in really plain terms? Well, probably not. But so to your original point there, what it does mean is you have to, as a pastor, it behooves you to speak the way the Bible speaks about marriage, which is not simply in a negative sense. And so that I think is where our real opportunity lies. I think most of us are pretty good about saying, don't commit adultery. Yeah. This is what the Bible calls adultery. It's very clear. Keep the marriage bed pure. And we're good at that. We're good at quoting the Sermon on the Mount and saying, even if you look at a woman with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery. And I'm sure you do this when a couple comes into my study and says, we're engaged and we're so thrilled. I got a call last night, actually, from a couple, and they were thrilled to share the good news that just, an hour before they'd gotten engaged, and they were so excited. And of course, we rejoiced together and gave thanks to God for that. And so when they come into my study to sit down, one of the first things I say to them is, hey, you're engaged, and there's going to be real temptation here, because you've made a promise to each other already, and this is a public promise. Likewise, there's going to be a temptation to consummate this promise that you've made. Don't do that, and if you are, you need to stop. And so I would encourage any pastors listening, have that conversation. Don't take it for granted that because they're in your study saying, oh, we got engaged, we can't wait to get married, that they don't need to hear that. It's your job as a pastor to say what needs to be said, and that is one of those things. And again, if I can dwell on that point for a moment, cohabitation is a problem, obviously, but I say it's a problem in the sense that not simply it's going on, but we have to say this is a problem, and we have to say to couples, you need to stop, and we're here to help. How can I help you? I mean, in a physical sense, can I provide you a place to stay? Is it something like that? What's going on? But you can stop, and you need to. Don't live together before you're married. If you are, you need to separate. And again, if I can just have a moment and say, we've all heard the horror stories of having that conversation. Maybe you have some examples in your own pastoral ministry of how that conversation went, right? I told them they can't live together, and their father, one of my elders, then showed up in my study the next day and said, well, you can't be our pastor, or something like that, right? If we haven't experienced it, we've all heard that story. Yeah. Maybe we haven't heard enough success stories. I have some. I bet you do too. Yeah. Where you encouraged the faithful of God to act according to the word of God, to live in faith, and they did, because God's word actually produces fruit. So my encouragement to all pastors, don't be a coward. Proclaim the word of God and do so in faith, that it will take root. It will produce fruit in those who hear it. And oh, by the way, that's your only hope. You don't have anything else. Right. The force of your will or your winsomeness is not going to produce the fruit that the word of God will. And the faithful, they don't like you that much anyway, but they do love God, and they love his word. So go ahead and have that difficult conversation from the outset. Don't just be happy that somebody showed up and said, we want to get married, because to the original point that you made, that's in a certain sense a rarity, that a couple 22-year-olds show up and say, hey, we want to get married. It's very tempting to say, okay, wow, I'm just thrilled. And you want to do it in the church, not in a barn somewhere. Wow, Yeah. So there's a temptation to just be so bowled over there that you try to skirt any hard conversations. Don't do that. But instead boldly confess the word with the hope that we have attached to it. So that's a bit of a front piece there. So ultimately, go ahead.
To just kind of jump on here, we are taught, and we know from the very beginning that, our arch enemy, the devil, is the most crafty of all of God's creatures. And he often, we know that he lies, but he doesn't come out like with bold-faced lies. Usually they're mixed truths or half truths. And I wonder if there's something going on with this as well, that, in the modern man's mind, adultery means you're already married and you've cheated on someone. Is there a sense in which we should try to kind of step back and talk about, to adulterate something is what happens in fornication, in pornography, and kind of all of our failure to live a chaste and decent life in what we say and do, and try to build up from there to say, when you adulterate something, you're rendering something poorer in quality by adding another inferior substance. And are you guarding this good, wonderful thing that God gladly gives you? Are you guarding it from inferior substances? And what are those substances?
Yeah, that is such an important point, Jason. That again, talking about the law does not mean simply to speak in negative terms.
Right,
Don't do this, don't do that. That's certainly part of it, right? Don't commit adultery. Why? Because God has something better for you than that. And to, as you well put there, to adulterate that better thing, which is to say marriage and a chaste and decent life within marriage, likewise, that's another part of this conversation.
Yeah.
Adultery or lust or any other ways that we can commit adultery, that those don't go away when we get married. I think there is this idea that those are two different things.
Right.
That before, just like you said, adultery means cheating on your wife. Yes, that is true. I don't have a wife, so I think I'm good on that front, right? I haven't. Okay, well, hold on there for a second. We've got a few more things to talk about here, certainly. But then there's that other side, too, that says, okay, so adultery means acting in lust and doing those sorts of things. But now that I'm married, that's not a problem anymore, right? And so we have to address both sides of that, and as you said there. And this is, of course, above all things, in a certain sense, anyway. It is above all things. It's a matter of faith, which is to say, what do we believe about a thing? What do we believe about ourselves, about the bodies that God has given us? What do we believe about marriage, and what do we believe about the marriage bed? Why has God given it, and what does it mean to keep it pure? And that's why this conversation, thinking in terms of premarital catechesis, this conversation that a pastor would have with, again, a couple sitting in his study and preparing for marriage, really, the question about sex, about marriage as a curb against sexual sin, it's one of the last conversations you're going to have. Because before you do that, you first have to talk about the whole purpose of marriage in general.
Yeah.
That God, before the fall into sin, gave Adam and Eve this blessed gift of holy marriage. Well, why is that? Well, he gives them there for the sake of companionship, of course. And so describing what companionship looks like and what that means, he gives them marriage for the sake of children, for the sake of bringing forth children, of bringing forth life, bearing the image of God there in their own flesh. And after all of those conversations, which as you well know, you're going to read an awful lot of the scripture together, and you're going to talk about some of the practicalities of companionship and of children, and you're going to talk about things like contraception. We don't have to have that conversation today, but it is part of it. Yeah. Before you even get to the question of, okay, so what does it mean that I can adulterate all of this? First, we have to say, well, what's the good? What's the good there that can be adulterated?
Yeah. What's the ideal? What is the thing that God sets up as the summum bonum?
Right. Absolutely. And so then the conversation, I think, follows very naturally to say, so we've talked about all of these other purposes of marriage and the marriage rite as we find it in the Lutheran Service Book, and some great similarities there between the previous rites that we've had, especially in the opening address. Mm-hmm. And it points then to these purposes of marriage. And that's then the line that I took for the title of my breakaway, that all persons who marry shall take a spouse in holiness and honor, not in the passion of lust, for God has not called us to impurity, but in holiness. Mm-hmm. So then that question about what does sexual purity look like in marriage means to do an awful lot more than to say, don't commit adultery. Yeah. Don't sleep with someone who's not your wife. Everything else, you're cool. Like just like, we don't even have to talk about it, right? Everybody good with that, right? Don't cheat on your spouse. Okay, great. All right, let's move on. And there's a temptation to do that because, as I said a moment ago, there is a bit of awkwardness there, but it's awkwardness because of the false view of sex that we all have because of the fall into sin.
Yeah.
Because of our perverted hearts and minds, and because of what the world tells us. And so what you get is go ahead. Would you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I just was going to say, so what is that false view of sex that the
Yeah.
world and the devil and even our fallen flesh falls for?
Yeah, right. And that's really the crux of it, isn't it? And the false view of sex that the world gives us is one of eroticism, one that excites the body chiefly, and then is used for the sake of self-satisfaction. That's the purpose of sex. And you see how that works. I mean, in advertising and all sorts of things, what's the purpose? Well, let's excite people so that they act to satisfy themselves, so that they selfishly want to spend money on something, right? The old adage, sex sells. Well, why is that? Well, because it tells. There's hormonal realities here. There's endorphins there's all sorts of things that happen that make us in sin want to satisfy our flesh. Well,
yeah.
As Christians, we know that's not right. No, that doesn't mean we don't need to be told. And that the point that you made toward the beginning, it behooves us as pastors to say that again and again and again. Crucify this sinful flesh that you have. Do not let it rule over you, dear friends. And when you're doing this or that thing, your passions are ruling over you. And there's a connection here between all of the sins that we have of the flesh, whether it be gluttony or whether it be adultery, whatever it is, your flesh is ruling over you. And we have to bring that under control through the power that we have in the Word of God, through the crucifying of our flesh, the chastening that the Lord gives us through His Word.
Well, what's the diagnostic in? I think we get this. Probably we can see the line in food. We can see the line in some of these things. But when you're married, what's the diagnostic to see whether you're using your spouse for self-satisfaction, or that this is an expression of the godly love that has been instilled in you by His Word and by the promises made for fidelity? How do we make that diagnostic on ourselves, or prepare for confession in looking at, have we crossed those lines? Are we letting our flesh rule us?
Yeah, if you don't mind, I'd like to hold on to that for a minute.
Sure.
And talk for a moment more anyway about both the negative view that we get from the world and then the positive view that we have, and then if you wouldn't mind, circle back around and say, now how do we abuse even this positive view?
Okay. Go ahead.
And so where I like to go here is to talk about the Christian's natural response to something being potentially abused, is the snap judgment that thereby we must forbid it. See drinking beer at a Lutheran church in the Bible Belt. There are drunkards in our midst, thereby no one should ever drink, right? And this is what we sort of naturally do. Can something be abused? Oh boy, that would be bad, right? That's a good judgment. Abusing gifts of God is bad. So nobody touch it, right? This sounds an awful lot like Eve, doesn't it? Don't even touch it. It could be abused, right? And so you see where that goes. And I think for an awful lot of Christians, for couples that are sitting across the desk in my study, they have this view. We have this view that says, don't even think about it. Don't touch it. Don't, put sex out of your mind. It's a bad thing. Because it can be abused. And when we get married, well, then it'll be a good thing. We don't have to, it'll all be okay. And so that's that. We'll have to talk about that in a moment. But so then what I would like to talk about then is, how is it a good thing? Mm-hmm. What's the purpose that God gives to us here in marriage, for sex for husband and wife? And to do that, I like to go to 1 Corinthians 7, as you probably would imagine when we're talking about this. I think St. Paul just gives us such wonderful words about how we ought to order these things. So if you'll permit me, I'd like to read here from 1 Corinthians 7. I've got the ESV in front of me, and I'll just read through the first, say maybe 5 verses. Would that be okay, Jason?
Wonderful. Thanks.
Okay, so here are Paul's words in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. He says this, "Now concerning the matters about which you wrote, quote, 'It is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman,' end quote. But because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each her own husband. The husband should give to his wife her conjugal rights, and likewise the wife to her husband. For the wife does not have authority, over her own body, but the husband does. Likewise, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except perhaps by agreement for a limited time, that you may devote yourselves to prayer. But then come together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So Paul there in 1 Corinthians, he goes through a set of concerns that have reached him via letter from the church in Corinth, and he's responding to them. And so here in chapter 7, we get this concern. Well, what about sex, Paul? And so they wrote, the church in Corinth wrote to him basically saying, right, Paul, isn't it right? It's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. And the subtext, I guess we could say, or maybe the pretext, is just what we had said before. Hey, we know this can be abused. And in fact, what we know about Corinth, if you read the rest of First Corinthians, my goodness, it has been abused. And so they go, hey, don't look at it, don't touch it, don't think of nothing. Just don't do it. Right, Paul? Right? Isn't that the response?
Yeah.
And he actually says, no, you're going the wrong direction. Because this gift of God is rife for abuse, then we have to take special care that it be used correctly and in the right place, namely marriage. So instead, he says, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. So because we're all tempted to sin, because we have sinful flesh, that we're filled with the desire to break the sixth commandment, to commit adultery in heart, body, and mind, we ought to have a spouse. Mm-hmm. Well, getting married doesn't mean we never break the sixth commandment, of course. And then Paul goes here into that. And he uses the language of conjugal rights. That's how the ESV translates it. I think that's not a bad translation necessarily there. Mm-hmm. The idea is what is due someone? What do you owe someone? Mm-hmm. And in a marriage, the husband owes his entire body to his wife. We get this language elsewhere, like in Ephesians 5, that your body is not your own. It doesn't belong to you anymore. You're one flesh with your wife, and your body is now hers, and you owe her due, that you are supposed to serve her with your body. And we know how this works in terms of you're supposed to go out and earn a living and provide for her. By the sweat of your brow, you shall eat bread, and your wife too, for that matter, and your children. You have to sacrifice for her. But also, you are supposed to give of your flesh for her, because she too will have sexual desires. And the same is true of the wife to the husband. Because of sexual immorality, because you will have desires for sex that you are tempted to use as you ought not, meaning you are tempted to commit adultery, well, then go to your spouse. Go to your spouse, and there are the right place and right use for actually these good and God-pleasing desires. Mm-hmm. It is a good thing, and this is the reordering of what the world tells us. It is a good thing that we would desire to have sex. Now, we have to have that conversation about children first, right? Mm-hmm. To be able to say these two things cannot be separated. God might choose to separate them. He is the one who opens and closes wombs. That's according to his good and gracious will, according to his divine providence. It's not really up for you to do. Understanding that, then, what's the right place and use for this? Well, the right place and use for sex for husband and wife is in marriage, of course. But I think it's worth saying one more thing, at least one more thing. We've got plenty of time. We'll say more than that. But to look then at verse 5 and to note the language that Paul uses. He says, do not deprive one another. Well, to deprive someone of something means that they have need of it. So Christians, I think, oftentimes have this view that even in a marriage, sex is sort of like dessert. You don't have to have it. It might be nice every once in a while. Maybe if you've been a good boy and done all your chore, you know what I mean. That it could,
it's extra.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Again, every once in a while, if you deserve it, something like that. But by no means should you have it too much, lest you come to expect it, or lest it become a regular thing, and then it loses its specialness. Okay, right. Well, that's not what St. Paul says. St. Paul says that for husband and wife to not have sexual relations is to deprive one another of something that is thereby we can make the necessary logical conclusion must be necessary. Mm-hmm. It must be necessary. Well, what is it necessary for? Well, it's necessary for that companionship that we talked about before. One of the first, that we would say the first chief purpose of marriage. It's necessary for children. I hope that's kind of obvious. But isn't that worth saying, though, Jason? Yeah. We live in a world where a lot of people, quote, have children apart from the act of sex. It's almost unbelievable to say that. At least I hope it is for all of us. But I mean, think about how many stories we hear about so and so had a baby. Well, they're two men. They have a baby together. What are you talking about?
Right.
No, they had a baby. No, they did not.
Right.
And that's an awful long conversation for another day, perhaps. But it's worth noting again that these purposes for marriage here actually find a fulfillment and a home within the sexual relations between husband and wife. This is the language being consummated, brought to its fullness. And that's actually seen there in, we might co-opt the phrase, one flesh union, as it's found in the sexual relations of husband and wife.
Yeah.
So we can't separate all of these out and say, well, companionship, absolutely necessary. Children, one of the necessary purposes here. Sex, well, maybe if you've been good. That's not the way the scriptures talk about it.
No, in the starkest terms, like you said, what you owe, I mean, it is an indebtedness and then a repayment. And then the word for deprive is like to steal or to fraud.
Right.
These are very... these aren't wishy-washy terms, are they?
No, and they're not particularly romantic either. I've got to say.
Not.
And that's always, this is fun. I don't know about you, Jason. I think premarital catechesis is fun. There's a great joy to sitting down and talking with the smile on the face of those who are just thrilled to be engaged and are looking forward to marriage. What a great joy that is. And I'd like to offer a bit of a rebuke for those of you who say bad things about marriage. For you pastors out there who say, "Oh goodness, I hate doing weddings," just knock it off. Pastoral ministry has its challenges. That's true. Okay, fine. But we should take absolute joy and delight in the fact that the Lord has called us into this office whereby we may give his gifts to his people. You're right. They're sinners. They mess it up. Well, so are you. Repent and then enjoy it, especially when you're doing something that ought to fill you with so much joy as premarital catechesis, preparing a couple to be married. And I hope, let me just say this too. I hope you love your wife so much that sitting down and talking about marriage puts a big smile on your face. I know it does mine. And this isn't me sitting here and bragging, my marriage is better than yours, you losers who hate to do premarital catechesis. I don't mean that. But what I mean is that, pastors are supposed to be sort of romantic about these things. I
Yeah.
really do mean that. And you get to set a great example for them, that you, with a smile on your face, get to say, boy, marriage is an awful lot of fun. It's an awful lot of work, but it's an awful lot of fun. And I hope you enjoy it. So
that is where St. Paul really is a great Christian to imitate. In 2 Corinthians, he goes all on about his hardships and what he's given up or lost. And then in chapter 12, he says, for the sake of Christ, then I am content, or I delight with weaknesses and insults and hardships and persecution and calamities. It sounds like what you're saying is you really delight, even though there can be difficulties and hardships that you endure in carrying out weddings or carrying out funerals or any of the pastoral tasks. You're really encouraging us to imitate Paul and delight in those things, because there's so much good, and that is being carried out because of God's word.
Yes, absolutely. Better said than I could have. I cannot echo Paul's sentiment enough. And pastors, I believe it was Heath who talked about being inspired. Wasn't that Heath that talked?
Yeah.
Your people ought to be inspired by you, folks. They ought to be. They ought to look at you and the joy and the contentment that you have in this life and see someone worth imitating. If not the pastor and his wife, who else? I mean, I hope they're parents, but you know this. There's a lot of couples who come into your study who don't have parents worth imitating.
Right.
So let that be a rebuke, perhaps, or an encouragement, certainly for all of us. But with that said, so you're having this conversation and you say conjugal rights deprive. You go, gosh, that's not how I was hoping we would talk about this. Well, the reason is because of the necessity of the blessed gift that God has given to husband and wife in their sexual relations. Mm-hmm. And the necessity is the joining together there in heart, body, and mind. And so if your body is not your own, then the positive view of this is to say that I have an opportunity to serve my wife here, and I have an opportunity to give of myself to my husband here for his own need. Now, the caveat I always give here is that this should be enjoyable, right?
Yeah.
As much as we're talking here in this law-sounding way, and it doesn't just sound like the law; it is the law. Don't deprive one another. That's Paul speaking a clear word of the law here and telling us that in marriage there's a responsibility we have to one another, and to not carry that responsibility out in the sexual relations of husband and wife is to break the will and law of God. It is to commit adultery because you are withholding that which belongs to your spouse. That's true. By the way, you're supposed to enjoy it, right? It's supposed to be a source of great joy and peace and love. And
I think I would point to also, I mean, just like St. Paul's admonitions for husbands to love their wives as Christ loved the church, or as his admonition to wives to subordinate themselves to their own husbands. This is something that the admonition is for them to willingly do it, not for someone on the outside to demand it.
Yes, that's right. That's right. And so to that end, what it tells us is that what St. Paul is saying here is that our concern has to be not chiefly for ourselves. Remember, the sexual relations of husband and wife is not actually chiefly about your own physical satisfaction. It's about loving and serving your neighbor here, your wife, your husband, which means that there's not that you're going to have to compromise, right? You're going to have to come to an understanding and agreement. And to get into some of the nuts and bolts of this, I think it's important to say to couples, and so I'm saying this to whomever's listening now, you need to have this conversation with your spouse. And you say, well, how often are we going to do this?
Are we going to be a once a week, a 2 times a
Yes.
week, that kind of thing. Like
Yeah,
actually sit down and let's
yes.
discuss. I would really like, so as the husband, I would really like to do this, I don't know, 4
How's
times,
every day?
5 times a week.
Yeah, yeah.
And then she's like, wow, I wasn't expecting that. What about that kind of thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. I was having a conversation in my study with a married couple, and we were working through some challenges. Everything was great in their marriage, but they, like faithful couples do, they wanted to talk to their pastor about some of the things that had been challenging. Thanks be to God. And one of the bits of pastoral care I gave to them, I said, you need to go home and have sex with each other, and you need to do this regularly. And as you well know, you've had these conversations with couples where they come in and things are pretty rough in their marriage, and you have that conversation, and they say, you don't even have to ask them. They say, Pastor, it's been months, it's been years, and you say, wait, what? Well, maybe that's actually at the root here of what's going on. So having some sort of schedule. Now everybody's different, right? But having that conversation above all things is what's really important. And then understanding, my wife threw out this number, I threw out this number, my husband threw out this number, I had this number in my mind. Okay. Let's compromise, because I love my spouse. I love my wife. I want her to be happy and satisfied. If this is going to be a burden for one reason or another, then that's on me to sacrifice of myself and of my desires here, for her sake. And so, again, that's also really funny conversation to have with 22-year-olds.
I'm sure.
Wait, we're gonna have to schedule this, Pastor. To be somewhat crass, they've been thinking about this an awful lot for a long time, and the idea that it's not like you mean there might come a time when it's not going to be the only thing on my mind. Well, yeah, it might just be. So prepare yourself for that and have that conversation, and then come back and have it again, and check in. How's everything going? Is this is everything okay? And to have that honest and frank conversation. I liken it in it's not perfectly analogous, but when your wife makes you dinner and she makes something new, she made a new dish, and you know why she made it? Because she thought you would like it, right?
Yeah.
Because she loves you, and she knows you love bacon, and so this looked great, and so she made it. She's going to say, well, what'd you think, honey? How was that? And you're going to be honest with her, because she really asked you, because she really cares, because she loves you, and she wants you to be happy. And you really give her an honest answer, because she wants you to be happy, and that it brings her great joy to be able to provide for the family in that way. So the same thing is true basically in all aspects of marriage, right? I was mowing the lawn the other day, and I was mowing the lawn because I was told the lawn needed to be mowed, and it was true.
Yeah.
and then I got can we get out the trimmer and the blower too, and clean things up around here?
Yes.
And I'd been back from Synod Convention long enough that was no longer an excuse. So so as I'm doing my work, I said, "Hey, babe, is that what you like? Does that look okay? How is that good?" Right? Because I cared that my wife was satisfied about this, because it was important to her. Mm-hmm. And so having that sort of attitude, hey, is everything okay? Is that good? Let's talk about this. Yeah. I'm open to rebuke. I want you to be happy. I want you to be satisfied. So tell me what that means in this case. And the same, of course, is true in terms of the sexual relation between husband and wife. There's a couple other things I'd like to kind of go down in terms of the practicalities of this, but go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, I was just going to say, so what, describe to me like a discussion on initiation. Do you talk about that? Like how often? In my mind, I think that the initiation will primarily come from the husband, just because that's how they think more. Just as how they're made, I guess. I don't know. But how important is it for the wife to initiate?
Yeah. So let me read you a note I have written in front of me on the sheet that I use to remind myself of what I'm going to say before I have this conversation with couples. Here it is. Quote, "It is a duty, but man shouldn't always have to initiate."
Yeah.
And that's kind of the gist of it. You're absolutely right that speaking in broad terms, it's probably going to be the husband who perhaps initiates more often than not. But it's not a job description.
Right.
So there's actually something there that can be encouraging to a wife to say, it doesn't always have to be the husband. Now, I don't know what your marriage and relationship is going to be like. I'm not exactly sure. And in fact, I don't need to know I don't need all of those details, obviously.
Right.
But just know that it doesn't, and it shouldn't always have to be the husband. And here's the other thing. If there is health in a relationship, just broadly speaking, and there's honesty and openness to the lines of communication, then there's a freedom there to be vulnerable. I get frustrated that the ESV and its suggestions there in the agenda for the Old Testament reading for the marriage rite cuts off Genesis chapter 2 before you get "they were both naked and were not ashamed." I find that to be an incredibly important verse, because what does it tell us about their relationship? There was a perfect openness and vulnerability, and no one was scared about that. No one was ashamed about that. They were perfectly contented with each other, and there was an openness there. Well, that is the picture of marriage, isn't it? That's the picture of a good marriage. I can be open and honest with my wife and tell her how I'm feeling, even about what she's doing or saying.
Yeah.
And she's not going to be offended. She's going to be very thankful that I wanted to be honest with her and open. And so that's this side of it too. That there should be a vulnerability between husband and wife. The marriage bed is meant to be a safe place. The home of husband and wife is meant to be the ultimate safe place. But I think we're also talking about how marriage has been perverted and sexuality has been perverted amongst the world, but especially amongst Christians. I think we have come to see sexuality as an incredibly dangerous thing, right? Like those Corinthians. Hey,
yes,
don't have sex. Don't think about it. There's this great line from the movie Mean Girls. I know you used to watch that a lot in high school.
Oh yeah.
That's what I heard anyway. Yeah. And there's this great line. They're having sex ed, and the teacher finally says, "Listen, don't have sex. You will get pregnant and die." I love that line. This is dangerous stuff. Don't mess around, right? Well, that's true, but that can really invade our thinking. Gosh, I know we're married, but I don't even want to talk about it. It just feels wrong. Well, no, this is exactly where you're supposed to talk about this, and to be open, and to be kind and loving and vulnerable toward one another. So that's absolutely part of it. There's another side here. I think
that's a really good point, just in terms of how. We were talking about adulteration and perversion, that often the way that God's enemies work is, not just to take it away, but to just completely abuse it, misuse it, pervert it, and adulterate it, so that it no longer holds the blessings that it once did. So that we don't receive what God really intends us to receive, and so we only see it as this bad thing to be avoided.
That's right. And my goodness, how can we say all of that without talking at least for a moment about contraception? I know that's not really the topic here, but let's talk about it.
Yeah.
What are the gifts that God has for husband and wife? Are they chiefly financial? Does God chiefly have in mind that the union between man and woman has to do with earning power? Is that what it's about? Is it about self-actualization or something like that? My goodness, no.
Mm-hmm.
It is not good that man should be alone, not because men left to their own devices, drink too much beer and watch too much sports or something like that. Mm-hmm. It's not good that man should be alone, because without Eve, Adam cannot bring forth life. Without Eve, Adam does not bear, in a sense anyway, the full image of God. The image of God is found in that God is the God of life, and from him springs forth life, and the rest of creation there brings forth life, but not yet Adam, because there was no helper fit for him.
Yeah.
And so God gives Eve to him that they might be fruitful and multiply. That is a blessing that God gives to Adam and Eve, really the chief blessing that God gives to Adam and Eve. And if we are thinking about holy marriage, but we're thinking that that is maybe a blessing that we'll take for ourselves when we want it, according to convenience, heaven help us, because that is the chief blessing. And for those who have not been so blessed to receive it, of course, we mourn with them. Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
So that's absolutely part of it. And this is what happens, right? So you have husbands and wives here who have decided that they aren't going to have children, or they'll have this many at this time, or whatever the case is. And by the way, if this is you and this is offending you in some way, please go talk to your pastor. He would love to talk to you about this. He really would. And if I'm your pastor, come talk to me. I'd love to talk to you about this. So don't. I hope I'm not being too blunt here, but that's just the way it is. And but what happens when we seek to separate the sexual relationship of husband and wife from children, then what becomes then of that is that we desire to have part of the gift without the fullness of the gift. And I think that we end up losing all of it. If I can be so bold as to say that, we end up losing the mutual companionship and the compassion and the care that we have for one another. And we're left then simply with the desire to satisfy our flesh, which is not the chief purpose of the sexual relations between husband and wife.
Yeah. It adulterates it. It makes it less.
Yes, exactly. And that's it, right? That's that conversation that we have with couples who say, well, yes, we're living together. And I think it's important to say, but before they're married, right? And I think it's important to say, first of all, this is contrary to God's word. Why? Well, because God has more in store for you than the satisfaction of your flesh. He has spiritual gifts for you. If in marriage we have a picture of Christ and his bride, the church, we are talking about something more than simply the fleshly satisfaction of one party or another. We're talking about the forgiveness of sins. We're talking about life and salvation. I mean, it's no secret there that in Ephesians 5, this always, I don't know about you, when I read Ephesians 5, sometimes I feel a little weird, right? Because we have the language of sanctifying her, right? And all of this, and you go, well, really, does the husband do that? I don't know. Can I say that? Am I allowed to say that the husband does this? Well, yes, because the husband's responsibility here is to be Christ to his wife, meaning to give her the forgiveness of sins, to sacrifice of himself, to point her to Christ. Not that he is Jesus, of course not, but he is to be her head, both physically and spiritual, the head of the household, to pray for her, to care for her in every way. And one of those ways is sexually. And so then that then gets to the question that we had before. So how then within marriage do we adulterate these gifts?
Yeah.
Well, one of the ways, of course, is to say, hey, remember when Pastor told us we had to do this and we were supposed to talk about how many times we were going to do this? Remember that we had that conversation, sweetie? Well, I'm thinking a lot. And he said it was, he said that's a good thing. So, and he said it was your duty, and that's what Paul said. So that's what has to happen.
Yeah. So do the duty.
Yeah. Right. Insist upon your rights, right? Yeah. Insist upon it. And Paul has a few things to say about that too, doesn't he? About how he could insist upon these things, but he doesn't. So that's certainly one way. And then we can think of lots of other examples likewise. But I think it's probably helpful in this sense to talk in sort of broad terms and to say, hey, you shouldn't hurt one another in any sense. This is not an opportunity for your own self-satisfaction at the expense of someone else. Don't do that. And you have to talk to one another, and you have to respect that. And oh, by the way, if one party, if husband or wife says now's not the right time, you ought to respect that. Because why would you want to do that if it wasn't the right time? You need to respect that and not take advantage of your supposed rights. Your rights are not for yourself, actually. It's to care for one another. They're not given. God does not give you your own flesh that you might satisfy it. So, I could certainly speak in more detail if you'd like me to, Jason. But I think those are sort of the chief categories of how we can abuse, how husbands and wives can abuse the gift of God in sexual relations, even within marriage, to insist upon rights, to take advantage of one another. You could certainly have also the lording it over her, talking about, the husband is the one who initiates more often, and he even sort of abuses that reality that he knows, like that's just the way the relationship goes, and so he's going to insist upon it. There's another thing here that I've got on my list that has to do with the physical aspect of marriage, like how you look, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I'd also like to bring up, and maybe just briefly, how our world has co-opted sexuality, as you said, sex sells, but how that has also kind of made its way into all kinds of perversion on the internet and in magazines and in just regular movies, as well as like television shows, and how this is constantly being paraded in front of us. So what are the what are the guardrails, so to speak, that we should begin putting in our married life, and even as young people, to raise them up into thinking rightly about sex, and talking to them about perhaps pornography and those sorts of things, or the avoidance thereof, I mean.
Right. Well, and they go together, don't they?
Yeah.
To speak frankly about what a thing is, and then we can say why we ought not do it. This is a David Ramirez line, right? You can't watch that. You've probably heard him say that, right?
Yeah.
Someone references some stupid movie or TV show, and Ramirez will say, you can't watch that. And you know what? We all are certain, maybe other people are tempted by this, but not me. Not me. I'm in control of my flesh. No, you're not.
Right.
And so we have to guard our eyes that we ought not put before our own eyes, or thereby put into our own hearts these sinful images and things that would entice us to lust. So
right.
that is certainly the first side of it. And there's an awful lot that could be said there about media consumption in general.
Sure.
And I think there's probably another podcast that you've done or that other people have done that say as much. Really, you need to get off of your phone and get off of YouTube or get off of Netflix, whatever it is, right? Because which of these things is really helpful for you, and how many places? I mean, my goodness. How many times have you heard your people talking about a show that contains all sorts of pornographic images, and it's in the zeitgeist, and so they feel obligated to watch it? Well, don't. And talking about setting an example. Hey, pastor, you shouldn't watch it either. You shouldn't look at these things either. You shouldn't. You should not have anything to do with any of these sexual perversions, and you have to put them away and put them out of your mind, and thereby that means put them away from your eyes. Yeah. So that is something to guard ourselves there, and even, I'm not sure exactly what to do with this, but maybe you'll have some more formed thoughts. I live in the middle of nowhere. I think you do too.
Mm-hmm.
What a blessed gift. Whenever I go into civilization, I'm frankly scandalized by what I see people wearing, by how I see them acting out in public. And again, I'm not exactly sure what to do with this. If we need to tell people to move out of the cities, I think there's a Sodom and Gomorrah thing going on here. But, if this is the community in which you live, well, don't try not to go to those places where this is how people act and dress and that sort of thing. But also, don't buy into it. Don't dress and don't let your daughters dress that way. Don't encourage your wife to dress in those ways.
Mm-hmm.
We ought to read First Peter likewise and hear the language of how a woman of Christ adorns herself, not outwardly, but in the heart there, which is a beautiful thing to the Lord. So that's certainly one side of it there. In terms of what we put before our eyes, the images that we see, and then what we do with them. Forgive me. You made a second point, and I've lost it. What was that?
Well, I mean, just in terms of encouraging the right response to those things. So not only trying to avoid, but also really just dealing with the confession of, as well as the prayer to God that He would kill these things within us. Like, I mean, so we are admonished every morning when we get up to slay and drown the old Adam with all sins and evil desires, so that a new man may arise and emerge to live before God in righteousness and purity forever. And so that slaying of the old Adam, it is not an abstract thing. There are specific sins and evil desires that we carry around within our fallen flesh that we are asking God to slay. And
that's right.
And we should ask Him to do so that we concentrate on the right things.
I think you're right, Jason. I think so often we have this sense that if I were a better Christian, I would have power over these things. I bet you get this feeling. I know I do.
Oh, yeah.
I fall into some besetting sin and I go, oh, here we go again, sort of Eeyore. Well, what'd you expect? I'm just a sinner with sinful flesh. Of course, that's what I did. No, you have the mind of Christ among you, which is yours in Christ Jesus. He has buried us through baptism into His death in order that just as Christ has been raised from the dead, we too may live a new life. And so to speak specifically to God and ask first of all, in the moment of temptation, in the hour of our temptation, to ask Him who knows how we have been tempted in every way, right? He's borne our sinful flesh. He knows what we're going through. It's not a secret to Him.
Right.
To ask Him for help in those moments, and then to understand the help that He has given us and to flee to those things, to flee to the sacraments, of course, to flee to private confession, individual confession. And also there's the practical side of it. There's the practical side of it that says, what am I actually doing about this? So here I am saying, I don't want to be tempted. Click, click, click. I've got my phone in front of me. I've got the computer open. Oh, please, Lord, help me not be tempted.
Right.
It seems kind of obvious what's going on here, right? Every time you go to this place, you do this thing. It's like, it's like the drunk having a job at the liquor store. Oh, I don't know why I keep bringing home beer. Well,
right.
You work at a liquor store. Like, what do you mean you don't know? But this is what our sinful flesh does to us.
Mm-hmm.
It makes us stupid. It makes us fools, where we say, I just don't understand why this keeps happening, or we lie to ourselves. Of course, our sinful flesh convinces us it'll be different this time. I can handle it. Remember, I'm strong enough. I can see these things and won't be tempted. No, you're not.
Mm-hmm.
And so having some practical things on that side too, that says, well, I'm not going to go to this place or do this thing or open this computer or whatever it is. And to be honest about that, and that's going to be some brotherly conversation, some conversation with your pastor, perhaps some conversation with your friends. You're certainly not alone in this struggle. That, sometimes we say that and we mean to sort of normalize it. And I don't mean it that way. I know you don't.
Yeah.
Normalizing it in the sense like, hey, it's okay. Everybody does it. No, it's not okay. And the Lord has given us a way out here. And the way is the forgiveness of sins. If you don't believe that the word actually works and creates faith in your heart, faith that does not desire sinful things, but only desires the good that God has for you, then that's a good place to start repenting.
Yeah. Yeah,
There's another.
I just pray every day, right? That God would kill those particular desires of the flesh, the lust of my heart, for that which is contrary to His word, and to instill in me a delight in the wife of my youth, and just kind of as a daily reminder that I'm not just saying avoid these things, but I'm also trying to point myself kind of like the skier who doesn't go down the hill saying, don't hit a tree, but rather follow the path. I'm
Right.
I'm
Yeah.
trying to instill what is the path, right? And it's
Well, and that
focused on
and
my wife.
that's right, and that gets to the necessity,
Mm-hmm.
to the necessity of husbands and wives having sexual relations.
Mm-hmm.
It's not simply that the wife can sleep her husband out of a pornography addiction or something like that. You're not his savior.
Yeah.
However, it can help, can't it? That a wife would desire her husband, that a husband would desire his wife, who has whatever sort of things she's struggling with. This is a good and God pleasing thing, and for husband and wife to be joined together. St. Paul says it very clearly here: because of the temptation to sexual immorality, let each man have a wife, let each woman have a husband.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's within there, the marriage bed, that we do find a practical help against this. But it's more than practicalities. I preached this wedding sermon on Saturday. Marriage is not just a matter of practicalities or opportunities. It's about Christ,
Mm-hmm.
and it's about the life that He has for you, and that's true here in the one flesh union and the consummation thereof that we find in husband and wife. There's another note that I have here that I do want to share. This usually gets a little bit of traction when I when I say this to husbands and wives, but it's about what happens when you're arguing with one another. You've maybe had a disagreement about something important. Maybe it's something stupid. I don't know. And usually what happens is you go, ugh, that's frustrated, and you kind of walk your separate ways, right? Don't do that. Don't let the sun go down on your anger. We know, sort of in a general sense, that men feel emotionally closer to their wives as a result of the physical aspects of their marriage, right?
Yeah.
Because they have sex together, they feel emotionally closer. For women, it's usually the opposite. They desire the physical aspects, the sexual relations with their husband, because they feel emotionally close.
Yeah.
Well, I'm not going to be able to solve that problem for you. Neither is anyone else, but you do need to know that. So we just had an argument. Nobody feels particularly emotionally close to the other person. Now's the time. Now's the time. Don't go farther apart. Come closer together. And that's my advice also in a practical sense to husbands and wives. Spend time together. This is part of the companionship talk that we have together.
Mm-hmm.
But you sitting on the couch staring at your phones or staring at a TV screen, that doesn't count. That's not what we're talking about here.
Yeah.
You need to sit and talk and enjoy one another's company. I bet there's business to talk about in a sort of worldly sense, right? There's things you just schedules to coordinate and bills to pay, all that stuff, right? But also, I think my wife's pretty interesting. I love the conversations we get to have with her. And I say this because I need to be reminded of that. There are a lot of times I think, well, I've got this to do there or that to do. I'll go sit here and do this, and she'll sit here and do this. That's fine. No. Go to bed at the same time if you can. Obviously pray together, read the scriptures together. And this, again, whether you feel like it or not, this is the time when husbands and wives should come together in sexual relations. And if you're never spending time together ever, well, what did you expect this whole thing to feel like but some sort of transactional conjugal rights, sort of in the worst sense feeling? Well, that's not what God has intended for husbands and wives. He has something much better, something that flows out of their love for Him, first of all, and then their love for each other.
Yeah, all of this reminds me of that quotation from Luther, and I don't know exactly where it is off the top of my head, but it goes something like, let the wife make the husband glad to come home, and let him make her sorry to see him leave.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, I think that gets to the point of joy within a Christian home and in a Christian marriage. And I bet you've had people say this to you about how many ever kids you have. And it's held true no matter how many kids we've had at any given moment. Somebody always has to say, oh, we couldn't have that many kids. There's too much trouble in the world. There's too much of this bad thing. Mm-hmm. Yeah. But we're looking forward to the life that is to come and the world therein. This is God's gift to us, and we have this great hope. Again, the kind of the famous Luther line: "What would you do if the world was ending tomorrow?" Well, I'd plant a tree.
Yeah.
Right. What would you do if the world was ending tomorrow? I don't know. We'd have a kid.
Yeah.
If the Lord so wills it, because these are God's gifts to us, and there's an eternal promise therein. And so, in a broad sense, sort of bringing things back around to the right purposes that God has given to combat the perversion of the world and the adulteration of this good gift of the sexual relation between husband and wife. Partly at its root, it's a joy and a hope that we have as husbands and a wife, a joy. Finally, this at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh, and a hope of what the Lord has for us in the future. And we find the fulfillment of those things in the sexual relations of husbands and wives. Mm-hmm. The hope that we have for the fulfillment of God's promise that He'll bless husbands and wives, the blessing that He gives when He says, "Be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it," that He'll join us together in one flesh, that He will strengthen us, that will sacrifice and submit to one another, that will be as Christ and His bride, the church. This is not a separate thing. Mm-hmm. Than a conversation about the sexual relations between husband and wife. It's the same conversation. Yeah. And so I really encourage, whether you're a pastor listening or a married couple or somebody who's not married who desires marriage, don't compartmentalize these things and say, well, we'll have that conversation later. No, it's all part of the same conversation about God's purposes and gifts for marriage. And we find the fulfillment, of course, in Christ. And think about the beautiful connections that we have there to Christ coming and bringing forth life, giving of Himself to His bride, the church, and the faithful reception of that. It's a picture of marriage. It's a picture, really, in a sense anyway, of the sexual relations between husband and wife, right? The giving and receiving, the bringing mm-hmm. forth of life. That's what Christ does for us. And so we rejoice that He does that, and we receive that gift with great faith, and we seek to live according to it, especially in our marriages.
Well, thank you for your time, Sean. Really appreciate the insight and the depth that you were willing to go into this topic, an important topic for really the whole church's life together, not only now, but into the future. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. There's one thing I forgot to talk about, Jason. I'm really sorry. The question of depriving one another. If we have another minute, I'd love to have a comment on that. And the comment is this. Paul gives a purpose if husband and wife are going to deprive one another. He has all of these caveats. And we know what he means here. If you're not going to have sexual relations with your spouse for a time, he says this, that it has to be except perhaps by agreement. So don't do it. Don't deprive one another except perhaps by agreement, number one, for a limited time, and that would be agreed upon. And then there's the purpose. That you may devote yourselves to prayer. So I want to impress that upon the folks listening. When we talked about contraception and we talked about the purposes of marriage and we talked about sexual relations, this can be a hard teaching. I want to acknowledge that. And Paul acknowledges that also and says, it might be that you have to deprive one another for a time that you agree upon. But you're going to do that to pray. You're going to take a break that you can pray. Well, what should you pray about? Well, you should pray for faith, that you would trust that God will bless that which He has given you. You should perhaps pray if there's a physical issue an emotional issue, that God would grant healing. But he doesn't. He's not talking about fasting here. I don't know if that frustrates you when we say we're going to set aside really good and necessary things. We heard this, during the Rona tide, right?
Yeah.
You can cut that if you have to. But we're going to fast from the Lord's Supper. No, that's not what we're talking about at all here. And so Paul is not saying, well, maybe you need to fast from having sexual relations for your wife. No, he uses the language of deprive. This is necessary. If for some reason you see fit that you have to take a break for a time that you agree upon, do it for the sake of prayer. Pray that God would grant you faith. Pray that God would heal whatever it is that is causing you trouble there in your marriage and in your sexual relations. But then come back together again, so that Satan may not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. So I didn't want to forget that important note there either. And Heath has such a great, Heath Curtis has. Mm-hmm. I know you're familiar with should Christian couples use contraception? Something he put together years ago. It's available online. Just search that. Yeah. Heath Curtis, should Christian couples use contraception? I give this out to all the couples as a conversation starter when we're doing premarital catechesis. And it's check it out if you haven't. But he's got a couple great lines at the end where he says, if you think you're an exception to the rule, talk to your pastor. And I couldn't agree any more with that. If anything that I or Jason have said today causes some sort of distress in you or frustration, or you just think I'm flat out wrong, you can call me up. I am not hard to find, or especially talk to your pastor, talk to your husband or wife, and have that conversation. But don't just get frustrated and write it off here. Yeah. But I know that you as a pastor, there's nothing you'd rather do than have the difficult conversations with your folks in your parish, with your parishioners. Because again, God has given us to one another that we might care for each other, even in the pastor, especially pastor-parishioner relationship. So that's a final note. As I mentioned, I would not want to forget.
Well, thank you for that. I'm glad you brought that up because it is really important. I mean, especially to end on the reminder that the relationship between pastor and hearer is not one of just pointing the finger and saying do, don't do, but you are there to be a father and to encourage and to bring along and to teach. So if there are questions, yes, please seek out your own pastor.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I so appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation with you, Jason. It's been a great pleasure. And I appreciate everything that the Gottesdienst crowd is up to and doing. I know my parish appreciates it and individual members therein. So thanks be to God for the good work you're doing. And I pray that all of this is a blessing to the Church of God in Christ.
Well, thank you. We love doing it. We delight in it, as St. Paul would have us delight in it. And
there we go.
Look forward to hopefully talking to you again.
That'd be a great pleasure. Thanks again, Jason.